The video you are about to watch consists of small government contractors performing illegal pass-through schemes. You should not do this. This video is created to help share resources for small government contractors to conduct business in a compliant manner. I, Derek James, am not a legal professional and am not qualified to give legal advice. If you have questions about topics covered in this video, or if you are unsure if you are operating in a compliant manner, you should seek legal counsel immediately. Let's get to the video. Hey guys, Derek James here, and I've decided to do a revamp of the legal illegal middleman strategy video that I did last year that you may remember or you may have seen. Since that video though, I've received a lot of questions from small business owners still struggling to learn how to apply limitations of subcontracting to their business appropriately. So I decided to do a revamp of the video. Now, if you're all set for your business and you understand the proper way to subcontract out to businesses and not do pass-through schemes, if you understand all that, then you probably can just click off this video because we are going to cover a lot of the same concepts that we covered in the first video. I'm just going to try to explain it in a little bit of a different way and hopefully that it sinks in a little bit better. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to do two parts. In part one, we're going to look at 3 examples of different companies that have committed fraud and either, the small business owners went to jail and served prison time, or they had to pay back a lot of money, or both, including an 8A example and a veteran-owned small business example we're going to be covering. And in part 2 of the video, we're going to cover some of those terms and look through the Code of Federal Regulations, which dictates the limitations on subcontracting so that you can learn the right way to subcontract without doing a pass-through. By the end of this video, I really want you understanding what not to do and why it's wrong to do pass-through schemes and really what does it mean, and to also understand how to apply limitations of subcontracting to your business if that's something you're looking to do. I don't want you to be afraid of it. Subcontracting with other businesses to perform government contracts is a very good thing and very commonplace and is encouraged by the government. You just got to do it the right way. So we're about to get into the video, but last thing is, I just want to put this out there. So many people have asked me, Derek, how'd you do the road salt contract if you can't subcontract out to another company to get the road salt? Okay, number one, you can subcontract. We just covered that. And number two, it was because of something called the Simplified acquisition threshold. It was underneath the $150,000. And what we're going to learn in this video is that contracts underneath the Simplified acquisition threshold, limitations of subcontracting does not apply. So if that sounds confusing, don't worry about it. We'll cover it in this video. Let's get into part 1 right now and look at 3 examples of what not to do. Okay, so for example 1, and for all 3 of these examples, I'd like to thank smallgovcon.com, which is published by Co-Prince Law LLC. I'd like to thank the guys over there for putting these articles together. It makes them really concise and easy to read through. So this first example, and I'll zoom in a bit for you, is this 8A fraud guilty plea in pass-through case. So a California man faces up to 20 years in prison after pleading guilty to 8A fraud charges. According to the Department of Justice, Wesley Burnett admitted that his non-8A companies performed all of the work required under various 8A set-aside contracts. And if the pass-through scheme wasn't enough, Burnett also admitted to falsely self-certifying his companies as service-disabled veteran-owned small business and also small disadvantaged business, resulting in additional unjustified contract awards too. So in 2010, Burnett met Yogesh Patel, who owned a 8A certified company. So Patel owned the 8A company. Burnett and Patel agreed that Patel's company would bid on 8A set-aside contracts, and then the work on those contracts would be performed by Burnett's non-8A companies. In exchange for this quote-unquote pass-through use of his 8A certification, Burnett agreed to pay Patel 4.5% right off the top, 4.5% of the total value of the 8A contracts. So between 2010 and 2013, Patel's company was awarded $1.8 million in 8A set-aside contracts. Quite frankly, guys, it's really not that much to be playing this type of risky game. Burnett's companies performed all of the work under the contracts, while Patel's 8A company simply served as a pass-through. This is what you should not do. You cannot be a pass-through. Patel previously pleaded guilty to criminal charges for his role in the scheme and is scheduled to be sentenced in January. Again, California man faces up to 20 years in prison. My God. So it says Burnett's pass-through scheme with Patel was not Burnett's only foray into the world of procurement fraud. So maybe that's why they're hitting him a little bit harder. In his plea, Burnett admitted also that he had similar agreements with other 8A companies and doing the same thing for the service-disabled veteran-owned small business game. So this guy was just going to town, taking everybody for a ride. Neither company is identified by name in the DOJ's press release. So in addition to 3 pass-through relationships, Burnett admitted that his company falsely self-certified as service-disabled at various points over a 7-year period. These false certifications resulted in more than $500,000, also in unjustified contract awards. Burnett has pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and faces a maximum penalty of 20 years in prison. He will be sentenced in February, and this was from, well, it looks like this was posted back in 2014, guys. But these types of articles are just as important today as they were when they were written. So let's take a quick look at this. So over here we have Burnett, and then we have Patel. Remember, Patel is the one who has the 8A, and Burnett is the one who's doing the work. So essentially what they did was said, hey, Patel, go out and bid on contracts, win some work, pass it over to Burnett. And that's ended up what happening to the tune of $1.8 million. And then in return for that, Burnett paid Patel, according to their agreement, 4.5% right off the top, which is a meager $81,000. And this is what ended up, getting him caught. So was it worth the $81,000? He would probably say no, but he had this type of scheme going on with many other companies that were 8A and service disabled. So who knows how much money was going on here at this game that Burnett was playing. Patel was basically one who was at the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe he knew that he was doing things wrong. I'm sure he did. But it's just, man, for $81,000, it's just, who would take that much of a risk, right? So guys, this is exactly what you don't want to do. This is example 1 of a pass-through scheme. So now let's look at another example. Okay, so this next example is regarding service-disabled veteran-owned small business fraud. Again, we're seeing the keyword here being a pass-through. So an SDVOSB set-aside contract was void and unenforceable against the government because the prime contractor had entered into an illegal pass-through. In a recent decision, the Civilian Board of Contract Appeals held that the service-disabled set-aside contract obtained by misrepresenting the concern's SDVOSB status was invalid from inception. Therefore, the prime had no recourse against the government when the contract was later terminated for default. So let's get into this really quickly. We have Bryan Concrete Excavation, which is going to be referred to as BCE or Bryan's company. This involved a U.S. Marine Corps with 100% disability rating. Mr. Jerry Bryan. Mr. Bryan owned and operated a construction company, BCE, which he started in 1999. And in 2006, he was hired as a subcontractor on a number of projects with this guy named Mr. Singleton. So after learning of Bryan's service-disabled status, Mr. Singleton urged Bryan to start bidding on SDVOSB set-aside contracts. Mr. Singleton even offered to assist Bryan in getting qualified as an SDVOSB to start bidding on federal projects, and he could even manage those projects for Bryan. During this time, Bryan and Singleton entered into a teaming agreement, which stipulated that Mr. Singleton would perform all of the work on the set-aside contracts. I mean, that's pretty ballsy to put that into an agreement for Bryan, and then Bryan would pay Mr. Singleton for the direct costs, the overhead, plus 90% of the anticipated profits, essentially leaving behind 10% of the profit for Bryan himself. So despite this impermissible pass-through arrangement, Bryan self-certified in the VA's SDVOSB database, and this was before the formal verification process that they have now, which is the CVE Vets First program that the VA offers for getting certified. So now the article is about to get really good because they're working together on a job, Mr. Singleton and Bryan, and then the job starts to go bad, and then the government defaults on the contract, and then Bryan actually has the balls to try and fight it And then they find out about this illegal agreement that they have, and then things get really slippery at that point. So let's see what they have to say. So in 2010, the VA issued a service-disabled set-aside solicitation for a chiller and air handling equipment upgrades. So this was a job. Brian submitted a bid, which was alleged to contain a forgery of Mr. Brian's signature by Mr. Singleton. So essentially, Brian gave the bid to Mr. Singleton, since Mr. Singleton's really the one behind the scenes doing it. He filled it out and this, forged everything and just submitted it. Further complicating matters, Mr. Singleton misrepresented himself to the VA as Mr. Brian. So he even posed to be Mr. Brian during discussions of the proposal. So the government probably made a phone call. And since Brian couldn't really answer the questions, because again, Mr. Singleton's the one behind the scenes doing all the work, he basically imposed to be him during that discussions of the proposal before an award was made. That's probably what happened. And then it says Brian was awarded the contract, BCE. A number of performance issues, though, hampered the contract, and the VA ended up ultimately terminating this contract for default. This is where it says Brian filed an appeal with the CBCA seeking to overturn this termination. What? This guy wants to appeal the decision? He was about to get off the hook? That's like getting pulled over for speeding with a trunk full of meth and then arguing with the cop over the speeding ticket. You don't argue with the cop. You take your ticket and you smile and you move on. Has this guy even seen Breaking Bad? All right, let's get back to it. During the course of the appeal, though, the VA learned for the first time that the teaming agreement between Mr. Singleton and Mr. Brian compromised BCE's eligibility as an SDVOSB to begin with, because they're passing through the entire job. So basically what they're saying here is Brian's case highlights just how little tolerance there is for concerns who misrepresent themselves to gain SDVOSB set-aside contracts. And guys, I'm speaking to you. This is for any set-aside type contracts. Not only can the government impose fines, jail terms, other penalties, but the underlying contract can also be considered void from the beginning. Oh, and speaking of jail time, it says Mr. Singleton was sentenced to 2 years in prison back in 2013. So let's take a look at this one and unpack this a little bit. So we have Jerry Bryan, our 100% service-disabled, Marine, who owns BCE. And then on the other hand, we have Mr. Singleton. They told us back in 2006, Jerry was hired to be a subcontractor in construction for Mr. Singleton. But at some point, a teaming agreement did occur for once Mr. Singleton realized Jerry's opportunity to go after service-disabled contracts. Mr. Singleton said, Jerry, why don't you start bidding? I'll do all the work, and you just pay me. Pay me to the tune of 90% of the profits and cover all of the costs, and I will do all of the work. So this is why this was a pass-through. Guys, I want you to remember this phrase: follow the money. Where is the money going versus where is the money supposed to go? So the government sets aside lots of money for small business set-aside contracts. And that's because they're trying to incentivize small businesses. The government's trying to pump money into service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses. The government's trying to help them. Government's trying to give money for contracts that are set aside for people like Jerry. But what Jerry is doing is taking the money and giving 90% of it over to Mr. Singleton, who should not be getting the money. And this is why the government has such a big problem with something like this. And that's why, follow the dashed lines now, they call it a pass-through. And only a little bit of the money is sticking to Jerry, and most of it is going to Mr. Singleton. So this is what you don't want to do. So one more example for you guys, and this example includes large businesses, since we haven't focused on that yet. So I want you to understand how this pass-through scheme can work from either side. Either way, it's wrong and illegal. So this third example talks about the Department of Transportation's Disadvantaged Business Entity Program, the DBE program, and they're saying large business had to pay back $5 million because it has participated in a pass-through scheme. So they're saying, according to the Department of Justice, this Waterworks, HD Supply Waterworks company conspired with subcontractors to list a now defunct Native American owned company as a subcontractor, when in fact the subcontractor's work was passed through to Waterworks. So according to the press release in 2008, the government began investigating various prime contractors. Guys, remember the prime is the company that wins the contract. It's the one that the contract's being awarded to. And in these situations, it's often what is kind of considered as the shell company, the company that's getting the money, but it's just passing through the contract to another business that's larger or doesn't qualify for a particular set aside. So the government began investigating various primes that claimed to have conducted business with a company called American Indian Builders and Suppliers, because they were a Native American owned firm. And this is a very sought after set aside. Any sort of Native American set aside is really hard to find. And it goes a long way with contracting if you work and, help Native American businesses in terms of a subcontractor or whatever. So the government incentivizes you to work with Native American owned companies. The investigation revealed that although this AIB Native American owned company had been listed as a sub on several projects, they didn't perform really any useful function of work on the projects. Instead, a third party that would not itself qualify for this DBE performed the work. So really, they're the ones performing the work, follow the money guys, or supplied the materials and received much of the financial benefit. AIB in turn would just collect a small percentage of the subcontract amount as a pass-through fee, just like we looked at in the previous examples. The government alleged that this company called Waterworks conspired with several prime contractors to falsely represent this Native American-owned company to perform the subcontract work, when in fact the prime contractors and Waterworks were the ones that were really using this Indian-owned company kind of in the middle as a pass-through. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in our examples in just a second. So the government alleged that the scheme allowed the prime to falsely claim that they're giving money to a Native American company and saying they performed the subcontract, when in fact it was not the case. This Waterworks company was performing on the contract. So in this case, they actually didn't give the name of the large company that had to pay the $5 million settlement. They're just calling it a large business. But let's take a look at what this looks like. So this is different than the examples that we've seen because this includes a large business now. So now what we have is a large business that is the prime contractor. Then there is AIB, the Indian Disadvantaged Business Enterprise. And then there is the Waterworks company, who's the one who's actually doing the work. So what's happening here is whoever is the large business that is the prime, they typically have what are called small business goals. And they didn't say it specifically in the article, but what's being referenced and alluded to here is that they were supposed to give X amount of a subcontract to a DBE qualifying business. And so this AIB company would have satisfied that. So what they're doing is Waterworks knows this. So Waterworks is going to all these different prime contractors saying, hey, I know you've got a small business percentage goal to subcontract to, or a DBE goal in this contract. So I know a company called AIB, they're Native American, and I can actually do the work. So just say on the paper trail that you are giving them, 15, 20, 25%, whatever the goal is for that particular contract, show that you're giving that to AIB. And then we on the back end will actually do the work. And then AIB will just collect a small fee. And, your subcontracting goals will be met. You're the large, you're the prime, you're going to do, an X amount on the job already. We'll take care of the rest. And that way contracting thinks that a Indian Native American owned business is doing the work, and they're going to be happy too. But in essence, they're not. Really, it's just the prime and this company called Waterworks, which is another large business. So everybody's kind of taking their cut. So this is another form of a pass-through scheme. Again, guys, follow the money. The money should be going from the large to AIB, but instead it's really going from the large to Waterworks, which is another large. So another example of what we don't want to do. Okay, those examples were a little crazy, right? Can you believe people are actually doing that? So in the next part of this video, we're going to take just a few minutes. We're going to cover some key terms like limitations on subcontracting, similarly situated entities, and even this simplified acquisition threshold to make sure you understand the concept of what not to do in those examples we just looked at. You'll be able to apply it to your business to create a strategy for your business and to see if limitations on contracting is even going to apply to your business. We're going to cover that in the next part. Okay, guys, let's try to start unpacking this. We're going to start out at the SBA website, then we're going to look more specifically at the Federal Code of Regulations. But to begin with, the reason why these companies and these examples that we looked at were fraudulent and not in compliance is because they were passing through, as we already know. But what this pass-through means really is that they were not meeting the limitations on subcontracting, meaning even further, they were not performing the minimum amount of work themselves, or what's called a similarly situated entity, which we're going to learn is a company that's just like them. So what the SBA has here is the limitations on subcontracting, and they're saying that you need to perform a minimum percentage depending on what type of industry you're in. So for service contracts, it's 50%, supply contracts, it's 50%, construction, it's at least 15%, and for specialty construction contracts, it's at least 25%. So this is a good starting spot as a guideline to not just pass 100% of the contract onto another company. But we need to go into more detail with this. And in order to do so, I want to look more at the Code of Federal Regulations itself. You can see that they are citing here 13 CFR 125.6. So let's look at the source of what we're talking about with the prime contractor's limitations on subcontracting. Really, what does this mean? I'm trying to make this video more detailed and more layman's terms because you guys really need to understand this concept in order to properly apply it to your business. So let's just take it off the top. They're saying in order for you to be awarded a full or partial small business set-aside contract, which all of us are small business, with a value greater than the simplified acquisition threshold, and we're going to get to that in a minute because that is a huge caveat to this. So whether it's, they're saying service disabled, hub zone, woman-owned small business, any of those, you must agree that blank. And then they start to talk about these different percentages that the SBA also just referenced. So they're saying in case of a contract for services, which so many of us are getting into, it will not pay more than 50% of the amount paid by the government to it, which is you, to firms that are not similarly situated. So we have two key terms, two vocab words for the day. We need to look at first simplified acquisition threshold, and then we need to look at similarly situated. Because if you guys can understand these two concepts, this is going to make a whole lot more sense, and you're not going to be losing as much sleep over this. So let's look at these two vocab words that we have. So the first one is simplified acquisition threshold. So they're defining simplified acquisition threshold as the dollar value, the dollar amount below which a non-federal entity may purchase property or services using small purchase methods. Non-federal entities adopt small purchase procedures in order to expedite the purchase of items costing less than the simplified acquisition threshold. The simplified acquisition threshold is set by the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and they're actually saying that it's $150,000. So $150,000 and under. But I do have to update you guys that because of COVID 2020, that did get raised, as well as the micro purchase, which really fast, what's a micro purchase? A micro purchase means a purchase of supplies or services using simplified acquisition procedures where the amount is basically up to $3,000. So that's micro purchase. But there have been updates to both of those, and I want to update you. So the micro purchase is increased. It actually went up from 3 to 35, but now it's up to 10,000. So micro purchase is up to 10,000. It's super easy for them to acquire goods and services as a micro purchase for that up to that amount. Secondly, the simplified acquisition threshold was increased from 150 to 250. So now we're talking about everything that's 250 and under simplified acquisition is considered for. So that's kind of our first take on this. Simplified acquisition, now we know we're talking about up to $250,000, right? And coming back to this again, what did it say in the first sentence? It said, in order to be awarded a full or partial small business set aside with a value greater than the simplified acquisition threshold, which translates to greater than $250,000. So if you're playing in the space of under $250,000, none of this is even going to apply to you. So it's really good just to take that, smaller purchases right off the plate. That's not applying to what we're talking about. So if that's your business, then you should be making note of this. Now, similarly situated, our second vocabulary word. A similarly situated entity is a subcontractor that has the same small business program as you, as the prime. So all they're saying is if you're a hub zone and you were awarded a contract for a hub zone and you subcontract to a company that is also a hub zone, so whatever you have, they also have it, then they are considered a similarly situated entity. If you're 8A and you sub out to an 8A, similarly situated entity. Same for vet, same for woman-owned, all of the primary small business set-aside programs. That's what similarly situated entity is applying to. So again, what did they say about this? They said, for example, in the case for services, it will not pay more than 50% of the amount paid by the government to the firms that are not similarly situated. Your ears should be going up a little bit saying, okay, well, what about firms that are similarly situated? So here we have subcontracts to similarly situated entities. And it's very, very black and white when it says a small business concern prime contractor that receives a contract listed in the paragraph of the section and spends contracts amounts on a subcontractor that is similarly situated entity shall not consider those subcontracted amounts as subcontracted for purposes of determining whether the small business concern prime contractor has violated limitations on subcontracting. So, and then they go on to say first that if you are working with this similarly situated subcontractor and they also sub it out to a third party, then those are bound by and limited by the limitations on subcontracting. But if you, this is the main point, guys. If you're a woman-owned small business and you sub out to another woman-owned small business, the government doesn't care when it comes to limitations on subcontracting. You, in essence, could do more than 50% as a subcontract to another woman-owned small business because the money is still going where the government wants it to go. The government's pumping money into woman-owned small businesses for the woman-owned small business set-aside program, and a team of woman-owned small businesses are getting the job done. The government is happy. If it's in the 8A program or a veteran-owned small business program, and you're subbing out to another small business that is similarly situated, this does not apply. So we're looking at really two kind of exemptions here. We're looking at simplified acquisition threshold of 250 and under. This isn't applying. But then we're also looking at similarly situated entities. It's also not applying. So then all that's really left is what does apply? Well, these percentages apply to any other businesses. So you could subcontract out to a large business up to these certain percentages, or other businesses that are not similarly situated up to these certain percentages. That's what these percentages are applying to. So I really want you to understand this concept when it comes to remaining in compliance for your business. Okay, so now hopefully you have a much better understanding of really what not to do. And if you are looking at subcontracting, know that that's a good thing and it's not something you should be afraid of. You just want to make sure that you are in compliance. And we covered that in part 2 of the ways that you can remain in compliance and not be at risk of being a pass-through company and get in a lot of trouble like those companies in part 1 did. So if you want to look into this more on your own, if you need to do more research, all those links that I covered and pulled up in my browser, I have put those in the video description so that you can do more research on your own. And also, if you liked this video, you found it valuable, hit that like button. And also, if you like government contracting, or if you're new here, consider subscribing to the channel, because government contracting is all that we talk about. We're growing a great online community, and we go live even sometimes where we can do live GovCon Q&A and cover some live topics as well. So you don't want to miss out on that by not being a subscriber. So until next time, keep knocking down walls to grow your GovCon business, and I'll see you in the next video.